Hi, and welcome everyone to our next session of our venture and capital interviews. Today we've got someone who's been a favourite guest of ours at sort of one of our different events. He participated in our recent Emergence event, which was literally the last live event that we've done. And I've known Leeor for at least about the last sort of probably 12 to 18 months now. And we actually met in Singapore, but he is an Aussie from Brizzy. So basically, I wanted to bring Leeor on today because, you know, when I was sort of keeping up to date with what's happening, sort of most specifically in the blockchain space, not just in Europe, but also in Asia, you know, typically that's where I have discussions with Leeor around. So welcome Leeor, who's a partner of Blockchain Valley Ventures.
Thanks very much, Steve. Good to be here.
Thanks, mate. And so just to kick off, like, what are you, like from a trends perspective, what are you seeing that's different in the last 6 months?
Look, I mean, over the last 6 months, we've really seen, I would say, the institutionalization of the products and trading environment around cryptos in general. So we really see some in the form of crypto derivatives and leveraged and structured products, which are coming onto the market. This is, I think, really taken it to the next level. And when we talk about the path towards adoption and people actually using these things, you know, independent of whether that's for a store of value or pure speculation or whatever the instrument is, we see more and more people coming into the market, and those institutional players who are able to trade structured and leveraged products are really coming on in a meaningful way. And, you know, independent of, let's say, the macroeconomic climate and the, let's say, impact that we're seeing of COVID, I think the opportunity for people to actually participate in this in a meaningful way and in competitive ways to traditional capital market products, that's really where we see a lot of the momentum at the moment. And that's just fueling a whole, you know, its own kind of whirlwind and momentum behind, let's say, Bitcoin prices and many of the projects which are building around that.
So a couple of things I want to unpack from that. Obviously you mentioned about the institutional side or institutionalization. I'd love to know from you is just from what you see when you go to the different events, when you're having your conversations, like one of the things I was pretty observant of is when we were doing specific blockchain and crypto events, I noticed the audience was a lot younger, right? And I found it interesting that, you know, a lot of this conversation, a lot of these markets were driven by, you know, say effectively millennials. Are you still observing that as a trend? And are you starting to notice some more senior figures in the sort of finance space moving into this area?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, spot on with the type of people which were pioneering this space, so to speak. And if you go one step before it even became a thing to talk about it with ICOs in 2017, I mean, the early players in were, you know, predominantly 18 to 40-year-old people from a technology background who were just passionate about what the underlying technology represented. So I think that evolution from techie to speculator and retail investor looking to get involved in a market to nowadays where you have institutional products which are available to people. And nowadays, I mean, the way in which you access and trade cryptocurrencies, you don't need to open an account with Binance, which has, you know, certain connotations to it for people who are unfamiliar with what's going on. And now you have, you know, exchange traded products on the Swiss Stock Exchange, for example, which are indexes of cryptocurrencies and underlying. So there is, you know, structured ways to access these instruments without having to go through the whole process of keys and wallets and management and all of these, you know, I think more complicated sides of what is ultimately a product that people are buying and trading.
Interesting. And you mentioned about being able to sort of trade on a almost like an index. The area that I've sort of always been fascinated by is how people are sort of overlaying blockchain across, let's call it physical sort of assets, whether it be gold or whether it be property. And just the way that, like one of our clients, Bricklets, for example, that participated in Emergence, they raised 9 million. You know, there's groups like Gold, there's groups like, you know, sort of in that area that we work. How have you noticed the adoption of that as a trend globally?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's been one of the biggest frontier opportunities that we've been actively chasing. So we want to marry that more traditional with the emerging financial industry. And that's really what we've been set up to do. And I mean, that's just an area which I think will be the growth engine. So the more sustainable growth engine in the industry for the next 2-3 years, where people coming together and bringing forward a way to access and trade products, which for a variety of reasons have been done either locally and regionally or just simply not at all. And, you know, you mentioned gold, you mentioned real estate. many of these things today can only be accessed for reasons by specific people, and there's foreign ownership restrictions and many of these challenges that make purchasing real estate, even residential real estate in a country like Australia, a very difficult and complex process. Now, I'm not saying that tokenization, that's just a technology applied to a process will solve all of the problems of foreign ownership and restriction, but certainly the way in which we're able to transfer and manage those transactions will simplify that process. And let's say the behind that comes the regulations that will need to evolve as a result of this simplicity and ability to do that. And that's really what I think we've been focusing on. And you mentioned commodities and real estate. To be honest, literally the last two transactions we did, finalizing our investments into, is one, the Australian fintech doing gold, and another one is a UK-based property tech company exactly in that space, not tokenizing real estate, but really aggregating different players throughout the value chain of the UK property market. And these are the things that we really see are at the front of the next wave of opportunities.
There was a report, I think, that come out from PwC, and I have to say, I have to confess, I just skimmed it, but the headline got my attention, where they highlighted that they expect over the next, let's call it decade, that most fintechs will be on blockchain in some way, shape or form. Do you agree with that consensus, and are you already starting to see that take place?
So, look, I make the one caveat to that. So objectively, yes, right? With the one caveat being that it's not just fintech and blockchain. It's really, we see every business incorporating some form of embedded finance. And that's really our central and driving thesis. Is what blockchain represents is the opportunity to marry and provide financial services, or that kind of last mile to customer services, that is, to be very transparent, one of the most profitable sectors in business and commerce today. And two, one of the things which enables a business to continue growing at a growth trajectory that venture capital and private equity investors expect when they're putting money into businesses. And I give you the other concrete example, which was recently, so PwC's done one, Andreessen Horowitz, which is one of the leading venture investors in the world, also put out a piece on how, from an analysis on their portfolio, basically the SaaS vertical, so companies which are doing predominantly enterprise software, able to increase on a 2 to 5x customer value by introducing financial products on top of their recurring SaaS revenues that they're offering to their businesses. And I think that mindset of not just financial services players being able to provide these kind of very low tech solutions, to be honest, but really anyone who has direct customer access and that real estate or that presence with the business should be able to complete that execution of a financial transaction. And that is really enabled, in our opinion, through blockchain. And that's a lot of the momentum for decentralized finance and DeFi and this peer-to-peer lending mechanisms that are going on at the moment. But that is really our central thesis, is everyone will be in some form a fintech player, and blockchain is a great way to facilitate that.
And when you're looking at this space, like one of the areas that I sort of got initially quite fascinated about, and I know there's been a lot of sort of, I suppose, time lag sort of in the development, was the area of sort of security token exchanges. And I know there's been, tens of millions sort of thrown into that space. Who are some of the main players now that you're sort of seeing in that area? And what are the groups that I think that I suppose I want to ask that you see are actually getting some sort of volume and some sort of adoption with their platforms?
Yeah, so look, it's a very interesting topic and a topical one, because actually just last week in Switzerland as well, the financial regulator actually approved the first OTF, so Organized Trading Facility license for a digital asset exchange, which they awarded to Signum Bank, which is one of the fully regulated digital asset and crypto banks in Switzerland. And these lines, I think, are being completely blurred and redefined between what is the role of a bank or financial intermediary and what is the role of a marketplace operator. And that's really the opportunity that we see, not just in the security token space, but if we also consider Coinbase and many of the other big crypto exchanges business models. Yes, they provide liquidity and a marketplace for trading and transacting, but what they really are is a deposit and customer facing, let's say, platform for people to store and transact value. So, independent of securities or unregulated products or whatever it is, I think these lines are being fundamentally redefined and blurred, and that in itself is interesting. And then when we talk about the tokenized security space specifically, this is really in two buckets, right? So one is around the actual creation of new financial products, which are tokenized and then issued. And then the other is, let's say, tokenization of existing securities and baskets of products, just from an efficiency and back-end operating perspective. And I mean, ASX, for example, has spent gosh knows how much, but time and or money, but certainly a big undertaking that they've done, replacing the chess system with digital assets, blockchain infrastructure. And these are the kinds of evolutionary things that you see, which everyone agrees is the technological upgrade of financial market infrastructure. So I think that's kind of unanimously accepted by most tier one capital market infrastructure providers in the world. And then, how you actually integrate that and upgrade a lot of these things, I think that's where you probably get many different perspectives. And, concretely on today, who's doing what? I mean, I would say there's very few players who have captured a meaningful or created a meaningful market around the opportunity, given one, differentiation of the products. So today, I would say most securities that are being offered in a tokenized manner are undifferentiated from traditional securities. So why go through the additional complexity? And two, I think, is just the time gap between coming up and issuing new products and actually being able to adopt them more broadly and widely. And that comes down to having the payment rails and infrastructure available to support this. So, you see players like T0 and Securitize, who are some of the largest operators. They've issued hundreds of millions worth of tokenized securities. So, there's issuance happening. But then on the secondary marketplace, there's less clarity over, what volumes are going.
What the volumes,
forward.
yeah. It's an interesting one. Like, what got me excited was I'm a fundamental believer that, let's call it secondary sales, right? Because that's why a company's going to list, is create the opportunity for secondaries and to allow their shareholders to transact. The idea for me was that I thought it would be a beautiful way, and I know people had high expectations of the volumes being at what they would expecting on crypto, but I know that's not quite the way it works on the security side. But to me, I sort of have that, that thesis that I would love it if there was more hope that there was the possibility for some sort of transaction, even more than what there is now, going through the typical methodology of a secondary sale. That creates opportunity. And I know for ourselves, like, we went through a secondary sale at one point, and the fees on that, just through legal fees and just the inefficiency of it, was astonishing. Like, and to the point that it cost somewhere between like 8 to 15K. And so that's where I sort of got enthusiastic about it. And even still now, just as a private company, the inefficiency in doing a secondary sale. So I know everyone's got the hopes of a large trading sort of volume digital exchange, but I just think that if it can improve it as a starting point by 5%, that's a phenomenal first step, but it's correct. And I suppose a different question I'd love to ask is if you think about sort of 12 months to 2 years ago, there was obviously a lot of projects raising a lot of money via ICOs. There's obviously still projects that are still tokenizing, still raising a lot of money, etc. What are you seeing now as far as blockchain-based companies that are actually now generating revenue? Like, where are you seeing that most? Because I've started to see it within our own clients, and I'm sure you're starting to see it. What are the areas that you see that are actually generating revenue outside of the, let's call it the sort of crypto exchanges and consulting services and so forth? Yeah, correct.
Yeah, no, look, so I think, there is that clear divide between, let's say, crypto operators and then people who are creating the wider ecosystem. And that's certainly been our thesis as well from day one was, let's really back and support the market infrastructure outliers. So people providing the picks and shovels to the adoption of what we believe is a new market standard, a market infrastructure standard. And, to that extent, I would say, two of the companies that really stand out. So one is a company called CoinFirm. I mean, in our portfolio, they have just done an exceptional job of working with and providing the AML KYC solutions that are demanded of banking grade quality and clients that they have. So servicing and providing analytics of on-chain information and let's say ownership of currencies and how it's traded and been transacted to be able to fulfill the compliance requirements of banks and financial institutions. So, these are kind of tailor-made on-chain solutions which have been created and designed specifically for the emergence of what is, we consider a transition towards more open source and available information. So everything at the end of the day is data, and then blockchain, manages and stores data in a specific way. And at the same time, we need a way to be able to process that information. And that's really that fundamental understanding of who is doing what in the chain. And it's great that everything's public and available and everyone can see everything, but there still needs to be people who are monitoring and controlling that, or not controlling, but are like aware of that process, because it is an unregulated place and there is no financial market regulator who's controlling what's happening on the Bitcoin blockchain intentionally. So these are the opportunities that we think have proven to be very successful business models, because there's a clear client, there's a clear service provider, and there's a clear reason why they are, let's say, better than other players, right? I mean, custom built technology supporting this type of analytics solution. So, there are a few players in these niches where we've seen perform very well over the last 24 months, and we expect they will continue to do so as the market continues to grow. And as I mentioned, more sophisticated products come out on top of this. So yeah, I think that's really, to be honest, that's really the base underlying of where we see the traction.
And do you see like if you look at most of the technology-based companies, they're either looking to generate revenue in one or two ways, typically by obviously a percentage fee of a transaction, or typically via subscription services. Are you also seeing that with sort of blockchain-based companies?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, prior to blockchain, so to speak, I mean, we at PBV mostly come from, enterprise software and tech business models. So that, that's really where our core competence is, what we've been doing, applying that towards the financial industry where we also come from. That's really been the marry of the different stakeholders is bringing together, as I said, when it comes to embedded finance, bringing together enterprise software solutions which are superior and demanded by their customers. So customers are willing to pay for that specific solution. And then the addition service that you're able to provide on top of that, this is how it's being monetized in new ways. And, in terms of emerging business models, I think at the beginning when blockchain was, let's say, hot in 2017, there were a lot of ideas around emerging business models which would fundamentally redefine that value chain. To be very honest, we haven't seen it in that way. There are definitely more opportunities for peer-to-peer mechanisms, but ultimately there are still companies providing, or companies or individuals who are able to provide those services. And the role of the aggregator, independent of whether it's decentralized or peer-to-peer, there will always be aggregators or people who are, bringing together liquidity pools, for example, in decentralized exchanges or in credit pools as well. There is still a role to be performed by a service provider, and the way they monetize that just so happens to be in a pretty conventional way as well.
And look, I won't ask you too much about DeFi. We actually had Henrik from Apollo on about sort of a month to 6 weeks ago, and he was sort of talking about that as an area. But even just over the last month, that's
changed a lot since he was on. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, correct. But it's funny, you talk about how it's sort of obviously a highly volatile area, but it's sort of no different to if you look at the buy now, pay later area in Australia. Like anything, if you attach the name pay to it, it's like suddenly it's been skyrocketing over a period. And then one small comment comes out about how it may be reclassified as credit, and all of a sudden, it gets impacted. So, look, I always see, typically I know people try and obviously, there's obviously been some crypto that's had incredible runs, right? No, absolutely no doubting that. But there's also been stocks that have also had incredible runs as well.
Including Afterpay, yeah.
Including Afterpay. So, so for me, I'm always fascinated by how, what is becoming of interest and what is becoming of hot, and also what I suppose people in the space are looking at. And I'm curious from your perspective, if we're having this discussion in 2025, right? What are the key sectors are you seeing that are going to be transformed by the technology itself? And how has COVID helped accelerate some of those changes that you're already seeing?
Yeah. So, I'm pretty clear on this. I don't want to say anything too negative on Afterpay, as I realize that's Australia's golden goose that just keeps on giving. So every time someone doubts it, I think the price jumps.
Goes up again, yeah.
So I'm not even going to go down that route. But, objectively, right? when we talk about the sophistication of those solutions, that's a financial services operation. That's a low-tech solution, and I would by no means consider that a disruptive business that has fundamentally changed anything other than the way in which credit is, or not credit, is given on a payment transaction. And when we look at blockchain, it's certainly for us not an interesting topic to go into those opportunities, which may be financially attractive, but long term, I don't think have the same growth prospects of the types of businesses that we are targeting. And I make that distinction between a Horizon 1 and a Horizon 2 opportunity. Is sure, Afterpay has a very good positioning on near term and really growing their distribution network. That's very impressive what they've done, and it's so impressive that PayPal also wants a piece of the action now. But otherwise, where does that really go from there, from its pure business? And I'm sure they will also diversify. So great management there that will do good things. But objectively, from a technology investor perspective, what we see is really the thesis around, well, what is the provision of a so-called wallet? I mean, what does this really represent in society? And going back to what I mentioned before on Coinbase, saying this is not only an exchange or a place to trade cryptocurrencies, it really is de facto a bank. I mean, it's a custodian provider. They will insure your deposits as well. So everything that you've become to depend on for your bank is provided by what is essentially a wallet, which, if you go to paper wallets online, I mean, you can in 5 seconds create your own bank account. And for us in Australia, maybe that's less relevant and less important, but for a lot of, let's say, the vast majority of the world, which operates in underbanked environments, I mean, the ability for them to operate a uniquely identified mechanism, which is cryptographically secured and trustworthy enough for people to actually transact with you and give you money. I mean, this is, I think, a fundamental re-exploration of what it is to provide and act on behalf of a person. So you can come in and actually create an account and transact with people in other parts of the world with little to no setup fees or costs. Now, I mean, that is not a perfect system and a model, and many of the regulations that we've created in society today are to protect and make sure that that's done in an effective way. But from a pure, what is the technological innovation here? It's really that everyone essentially can become and be their own banking institution and manage the inflows and outflows and what type of leverage or what type of issuance that they're offering on top of this, and manage that process at essentially a low to no cost environment. And I think this is really something which is not necessarily intuitive, but when we look at what drives fintech today, it's basically retail-oriented fintech business is chasing low customer acquisition cost businesses in order to be able to scale and provide meaningful mass to then be able to sell more attractive products later down the road. And I think that kind of mindset and mentality is what allows for what I think is the best model of managing customer bases, which is this wallet first and wallet led banking services and solutions. And I think it's really in the next 5 years, and looking back, I mean, this will be the thing that everyone will just have at least one to multiple wallet solutions, which is de facto their bank account and operating in a much simpler and efficient way without necessarily the same complexity that you have today.
So interesting, because I love, obviously given the space we're in, obviously I love the financial analogies. And if you were to make some bold predictions in areas like agriculture, for example, or healthcare, what sort of things are you, from a technology perspective, are you seeing that I know we've got companies like it's just literally just going from my head. AxiChain, yeah. So Linda from because obviously companies like AxiChain I've found fascinating. We've also worked with healthcare companies that are sort of utilizing blockchain. So where do you see as the biggest opportunity? Because to me, I thought one of the things we always talk about is that if you look at markets move towards efficiency. Anytime there's an efficiency created, you'll have the general early adopters, right? And then you have the sort of follow-on sort of adoption, which does take a lot more time. So what are some of the trends that you've been observing?
Yeah, no, definitely. So, exactly, a great example with AxiChain, and I'm also invested in a company called Rice Exchange, which basically does the same thing for the rice industry, and bringing together these people. So, first and foremost is really acknowledging that there is an opportunity to do things better when it comes to managing stakeholders or different stakeholders in an industry, and that end-to-end process of provenance to consumption, whatever product that is. I think this is something which touches many hands. A lot of value gets extracted, and there's a lot of slippage along the way over what can and does happen. And basically that's where we really see the other side of the industry, so the non-financial side of it, is really an equally critical part of what blockchain represents, but with the caveat being that it's fundamentally a different opportunity. Because if we break it down, in blockchain in itself is the idea of creating or facilitation of peer-to-peer activities. And when we have financial transactions, I mean, that's very intuitive that you and I are exchanging value and we have agreed to do so. And the fact that we choose to use the banking system or whatever mechanism that we choose to do that with today is in theory up to us. No one was giving us a choice, but that's just typically how it's done. When you look at some of the supply chain and value chain intermediaries, I mean, for them it's not a clear case where it's you and me are exchanging the value. It's really a product which may change forms many times until it's consumed. And these value-added services are added and created, and it's really about bringing people together. And so in those scenarios, I mean, blockchain is really this kind of trusted database for people to collaborate around, and let's say the supply chain example. But then in the financial example, it's really, we don't even need a third party to do anything. So I have to say we're much more bullish on opportunities which remove intermediaries and players altogether, because I think that's where you really have the notion of what at least Bitcoin was set out to do, was to make this trustless system. But then there's, very specific cases in industries which are operating value chain aggregation is equally attractive. And we also in the healthcare industry have made an investment in a UK-based pharmaceutical supply chain player. So, we recognize and see this as well, but it is slightly differently nuanced. And I think the upside potential is also fundamentally different.
So I'm glad I picked all the sectors to ask about that you've actually invested in without,
exactly.
I was going to say without, obviously I knew the financials. Anyway, so is there any sector that I haven't mentioned yet that you see that you're sort of looking at as there's a Horizon 2 opportunity where that sort of transformation is sort of on the verge of taking place that investors could sort of investigate further?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I mentioned it a bit at the beginning, but the thing that we see most at the moment, I wouldn't consider it that kind of Horizon 2 opportunity, because I think it's less disruptive, but the next 12 months is really this idea of derivative products and actually creating something which is, if we look at how credit works in the traditional financial system, I mean, you see the ratio of credits to debits basically, or how debt is actually structured and offered. And providing this access to instruments, I mean, that's really the growth engine for the near term. That will be the main thing that people's time is going towards. So the way in which people are playing and complementing in that space, I mean, we've seen a lot of M&A activity already start and will continue to operate in this industry. And that's really where I think, bringing together the difference between who are the people trading in the market and why are they doing it, and what are the actual applications of blockchain. I think the derivative space really brings both of those together to say, yes, we recognize that there are elements of crypto that is a financial instrument and we're trading it. And the reason we trade it is because I have unparalleled access to leverage, which I'm not given in traditional markets, for better or for worse, right? So that's another topic completely, but people's access to leverage is fundamentally different. And potential for superior outsized returns, which I think everyone who's in this space typically gets excited when they've seen some of the risk return profiles being announced, and people often talk about the successes. But certainly when you're doing 10, 100x leverage on Bitcoin futures, I mean, there's certain scope for returns which people genuinely get excited about, because they think this could be my retirement ticket here. So I don't want to discredit or undermine anyone's dreams and objectives and goals in the industry, but it certainly has attracted many different types of people looking for. It's
also a great way to burn money fast.
Well, exactly. Exactly. And a lot of the Robinhood day traders at the moment, I think, are feeling a bit of a pinch.
Mate, those memes that have come, the Robinhood day trader memes that come out are just fantastic. I don't know if anyone follows the Instagram account Liquidity. Or,
absolutely.
Praying for exits. Oh my God, they are so funny.
It's great. Yeah. So you can definitely relate.
Yes. I was going to say, final question I have for you is, there is so much information in this area, whether it be blockchain and crypto, and it is genuinely hard to keep on top of. I'm super lucky that I know people like you, and obviously Dom and Holger, and and obviously Fran in New Zealand, that I can sort of chat to about it. Just curious, what are your sort of information sources that sort of give you, I suppose, sort of quick information, but good high level information about what's happening in space and what's sort of trending?
Yeah. Yeah, so look, I think it really is a case by case basis, right? So a lot of it, I have to say, when it comes to topics of crypto and trading on the markets, I mean, this is really, to be honest, a lot of the social media presence and channels where you have influencers making that work. And I think for better or for worse, that's kind of how the industry's aggregated, where it is a decentralized movement, and a lot of the stuff is just happening based on momentum driven and social predictions, which are happening in the place. And there are initiatives like Lunar Crush and indexes being created around actually tracking altcoins based on number of tweets and activities and social media mentions, which are actually creating their own scores. And I think these are fantastic innovations for something which is community driven solutions for this space. So I think there are a few of these players which make it interesting, and certainly where we are equally a part of looking and following. And then when it comes to, I would say, what our core business and focus is, which is private market opportunities in blockchain and fintech. I mean, there it's really the traditional places. I mean, CoinDesk, of course, is kind of the de facto, the Wall Street Journal of crypto. But that being said, there is a reason why there's not that many providers out there anymore, right? So post 2017, I think there's been a huge consolidation of news in the industry, and I think that makes a lot of sense because one, there shouldn't be that much news. I mean, we're not that big an industry, and two, I mean, it really is something which is just evolving so quickly and should be part of mainstream news as well. So anything really worth talking about should find its way into the Australian Financial Review just as well as it is on CoinDesk. So that's really the idea and what we're about as well.
Fantastic. Well, Leeor, always love chatting with you, mate. Thank you so much for your time.
Excellent.
And I know you're flying back to Switzerland today, so thanks for making the effort.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time, and look forward to our next catch up, Steve. So all the best.
Brilliant. Thanks, Leeor.
Thanks. Bye.